Hello, everyone. So, today's topic World War II. I was talking to my friend, and like she brought up World War II, and yeah. Okay, so I'm old. I was born in 1970, and for like us, World War II wasn't that far away. It was like what, 25 years since the war ended. Let's say 45, 55, 65, 25 years. So it was more of a reality for us. Like nowadays, I think, young people think of World War II as ancient history. But for us, it was like, wow, that's kind of just happened not too long ago. So my dad used to tell me, ever since I was a little kid, he would tell me about stories of how he grew up during World War II in Germany, in Berlin. He would, yeah, he would tell me those stories, and I would be so fascinated by them. And it just created a lifelong fascination with World War II. How he'd tell me those stories. I don't remember him telling my older brothers those stories, like us three together. It was usually just when it was just me and him. And so, yeah, he was born in like November 24th, I think, on 1939. And in Berlin, Germany, and there's a description about that, but absolutely he grew up during the war. Considering he was a really little kid at the time, he had a lot of good memories about it, a lot of vivid memories. And so I'm just going to tell you about some of the memories that I remember him telling me about. So he remembers the bombings. The Allies started bombing Berlin actually early in the war. Uh, and so he remembers the bombs dropping, the air raid sirens screaming and running down into the air raid shelters. And they lived in the center of Berlin on like a side street, Kniesebeck 73, I think. And it's basically the most famous street in Berlin, Kurfürstendamm. So he remembers running down to the air raid shelters and staying there with family and all while the city was being bombed. And then one day he came up out of the air raid shelters. His neighborhood was bombed and rubble. And he saw a person underneath the rubble of rocks, a pile of rocks. And just his arm was showing. And he grabbed the person's arm and started pulling it, trying to free him from the rubble. He was 4 years old at the time. So he's pulling this guy's arm, and he pulled it. And all there was an arm. The arm was severed from the guy's body. And he pulled out a severed arm. Yeah, it's crazy. 4-year-old kid pulls out the severed arm or a person he's trying to help. Sorry, I'm trying to do this video without getting too emotional. Anyway, yeah, so, yeah, he remembers all the bombing raids. One time he was at his grandmother's house. And uh, the air raid sirens went off. But they didn't have time to run down to the air raid shelter. And so the grandmother, his grandmother, my great grandmother, told him to go hide under the tables. And then a bomb hit the apartment building. And okay, after the air raid shelter is over, the kids come out, they crawl out from under the table, and they all start laughing. Why are they laughing? Half their apartment was blown away, and they all start laughing. Because the grandma was covered completely black with soot from the fireplace. Yeah, they had fireplaces in apartments at that time. And she was covered with completely black. And yeah, okay, they all laughed and said, "You look like a..." Okay, YouTube will block me for saying the word, so I won't say it. Because in German, it's not a bad word. Okay, nigga. It just means a black person, right? It's not considered a slur or anything, right? It just means a person with black skin. Okay. So yeah, even during times of war, and they found ways to laugh. And yeah, it was. I asked my dad, like, so, like, were you afraid? Were you, like, you know, traumatized or what? He was like, and did you think, like, whoa, what's going on? Whoa, what is happening? This is so crazy. This is so insane. And it's like, no. I just thought that was normal. I thought that was how people live. I didn't know anything else. I just thought that's how people normally live. He was only like 4 years old. He didn't have any experience outside of, war and bombs dropping on his house and having to run down to the air raid shelters. He just thought that was normal. Yeah, he was probably scared sometimes. But for him, that's how people live. I just thought that's how people live. And that's normal. That is so weird. And so, like, really, really deep and thought about Well, like a kid could think that's just normal. Of course, it was like, I don't even know if I can use the word traumatized. I mean, the memory lived with him forever about trying to save that person and pulling him out from under the rubble. And he pulled out his severed arm. But in the same way, all that was just normal for him because he never knew anything different. So, when the mob bombings got really bad, they moved out to the countryside. And so they were staying in the countryside. And not in the camp. They had their own private house. Uh, like usually, like kids were sent to the countryside to escape the bombings and all. But they had their own private place. And the war ended, and one day and everybody was hungry, there was no food. And one day he was just roaming around and saw a bunch of Soviet soldiers. And he spoke Russian because his grandmother spoke like 7 languages, and his grandmother and mother were born in Russia, actually, in St. Petersburg. But his father was German. Um, Actually, his father, my grandfather, died pretty much exactly like, okay, 43. I don't want to do the math. He died in March 1943. He was an officer in the German army serving on the Russian front. He volunteered to serve on the Russian front. And we don't know the exact details, but he was wounded and sent back to Berlin and died. I should probably talk about that then before I talk about the other part. So yeah, my grandfather, we don't know what happened exactly. All we know that he volunteered to serve on the Soviet front. Why? Because he was German, but he actually liked Russians and loved and admired their culture, especially Dostoevsky. Seriously. If you know, I love Dostoevsky also. And one of the stories is that he served during World War One, and he was wounded. And this was, of course, before the Bolshevik Revolution, and when it was still Imperial Russia. And the Russians took so good care of him. They treated him as one of their own, and just absolutely had no prejudice against him that you're the enemy or anything. They treated him as one of their own. And he learned to love Russians and Russian culture because pretty much they saved their life. And so why he volunteered to serve on the Soviet front. He was already like my age, actually. My grandma was 20 years younger than him. He was my age or a little older because he wanted to liberate the Russian people from communism. That was the thing at the time. A lot of like immigrants from Russia that wound up in Germany and in Europe, yeah, they really believed that the Germans were going to liberate Russia from communism and free Russia. Um, yeah. And so my grandfather, even though he was German, but he really admired Russians. His name was August Paulus Wagner. And yeah, and he gave his life. So he was, I don't know, wounded. Some versions of the story is that he had simple appendicitis, but that's not really believable. Anyway, he was transported back to Berlin to the, military hospital. And he was dying. And they couldn't do anything to save him. Again, we don't know what exactly happened. It can't be appendicitis. That's a ridiculous story. He must have been wounded. And my dad remembers and told me this story often. So they're in their apartment, and his mother says, we're going to see Papa. He's in the hospital with like my mother and their older sister. He had a younger brother, but I don't know if he doesn't. He didn't mention that about. Well, anyway, my father says, "I want to visit Papa too," and his mother said no because she knew he was dying. And she didn't want to. She didn't want her son to see his father dying. They knew that he'd be dead. Anyway, yeah. I want to see Papa too. No. Anyway, from the sources I have, he had a full military funeral. He's buried in Borsig, ironically, in the Russian Orthodox cemetery in Borsig. Yeah, he really loved and admired Orthodox, like Russian culture. And his wife was Orthodox Christian, Russian Orthodox, and so yeah, every time I'm in Germany, I visit his grave. So yeah. So then the bombing was getting severe, so they went to too severe, even for them. So they went to live in the countryside, in a house in the countryside. So then, okay, my dad knows like these Soviet soldiers, and since his mom and grandma were born in Russia, his grandma was German actually, but born in Russia. He spoke and knew Russian, right? And they spoke Russian at home. And so he comes up to, so he sees these like Soviet soldiers and with this big, gigantic cauldron of food. and they were starving. Everyone was basically starving at the time, unless you're in the military. Okay, so this was right at the end of the war. And he comes up to one of the soldiers who is stirring the cauldron of food, and he tugs on his pant leg and asks in Russian, like, "Can you give me some food? I'm hungry." And so the Soviet soldier gave him some. He's like, "Go get a bowl." And so he runs home and gets a bowl and comes back, and like the soldier gave him a bowl full of food, which he really, really enjoyed. And then he asked, "Can you give me some more for my family? My family are very hungry. Right? We're starving." And so the soldier gave him some more food that he took back to his family. And his mom, and they had a nanny at the time. That's another story. The nanny came to live and work with them when she was 16, when they still lived in Imperial Russia, uh, and in St. Petersburg, and stayed with them till the end of her life. And the nanny asked, "Where did you get this food? Where did you get this food?" He was like, "Oh, the Russian soldiers gave it to me." She's like, "Are you crazy? What are you doing? Did they follow you? Did they follow you? You're putting us in danger." And but she portioned out the food, and everybody ate. And like grandmother asked, like, "Where'd you get this food?" And she made up some kind of lie. And Nanny made up some kind of lie. And sure enough, the Soviet soldier was following them. And like the next day or a couple days, he like he started banging on the door, right? Shouting in Russian, "Open up, open up, open up." And grandmother, uh, their mother wasn't there at the time. She was somewhere else, lost somewhere else, I guess, or I don't know. But it was just the grandmother and the nanny. And so the grandmother told the kids, "Go hide under the table." And there was like a tablecloth, so you can't see who's under it, right? And don't say a word. And then she shouts at the nanny, not shout. Okay, she said to the nanny, like strongly, "You are deaf and dumb. You cannot speak and you cannot hear," because the nanny only spoke Russian. So she opens the door to this Soviet soldier, and he's like, "Where are you from? Let's see your documents. Your child speaks perfect Russian. You're Russian. You have to be returned to Russia." Because Stalin made a rule that all like immigrants that were found in Western Europe have to be sent back to Russia, right? Where they would be put in concentration camps or killed. So and grandmother, well, my dad's grandmother, my great grandmother, was like, "No, I'm a German citizen. Look at here's my document." Oh, and yeah, and she started talking to him in German, and the officer is like, "Why does your child speak perfect Russian?" Well, because I'm great grandmother answered, because I'm a cultured person. I teach my children many languages. I speak 7 languages. And she started talking to them in Finnish, in French, in Italian, and then they saw a portrait of Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar, that was on the wall. What, you have a picture of this bloody Nicholas on the wall? And like, and that's the story I heard from my family. And like, take that portrait down. And she said, "No, you can kill me, but I will not take that portrait down." And then the officer saw um, the nanny, and he's like, "She is a Muscovite. She is from Moscow." And he comes up to her and starts screaming in her ear, "Who are you? What's your name?" And my great grandmother, their grandmother, said, "She's deaf and mute. She doesn't understand anything, or can't hear, can't speak." And that's when the officer started screaming in her ear. And Nanny just sat there completely emotionless and just kept knitting as if she didn't hear anything, though she absolutely heard the officer screaming in their ear. Screaming in her ear, right? It must have been kind of painful, actually. But she just completely ignored it, like she didn't hear anything. So then the officer went away and said, "We're going to come back for you tomorrow and deport you back to Russia." Okay, this is turning into a really long video. Okay, but maybe I'll stop there because, yeah, I'll tell the second part later. Okay, so from being bombed in Berlin to, okay, the next stage is being deported to Russia by Soviet soldiers. Okay. I'll stop there. If you're interested to hear the story further, let me know. Dude, I haven't slept in such a long time. If I look weird and like I'm kind of drunk or something, no, I'm not drunk. It's because I haven't slept. I haven't slept in like, I don't know, man. I slept like 4 hours a night. I went like 62 hours without sleeping. Anyway, that's not the point. That's why I'm acting weird. I'm sleep deprived, but full of energy. Okay, so if you want to hear the rest of the story, let me know. I still can remember more stories that my dad told me. Yeah, about the times in Berlin. Okay, let me know. All right, goodbye. До свидания. Auf Wiedersehen.